September 19, 2023, 8:14 a.m. An excavator blade screeches against buried steel in a foggy pasture outside Arracourt, France. The jarring sound echoes across the damp morning air, causing the operator, Jean-Luc, to slam on the brakes. He isn't looking for history. He is digging a drainage ditch for a new housing development on the edge of the Lorraine region. He climbs down from the cab, his boots sinking into the thick clay that has defined this landscape for centuries. He expects an unexploded shell, a common enough nuisance in this part of France, known locally as the iron harvest. He wipes the mud from the obstruction with a gloved hand. It isn't a shell. It is a flat, olive-drab plate of rusted armor welded at a distinct angle. Jean-Luc calls the local prefecture, who in turn contacts the Department of Subaquatic and Undersea Archaeological Research, though this is dry land. By noon, a specialized team arrives with ground-penetrating radar. The readout is massive. It isn't just a fragment of debris. Buried under 12 feet of sediment is a complete chassis of a 30-ton machine. As they carefully brush away the decades of soil, the white star of the United States Army emerges on the glacis plate, followed by a serial number and a hand-painted name partially obscured by oxidation. This is a Sherman tank, the workhorse of the American war effort, but something is wrong. The turret is rotated to the 6 o'clock position, the barrel facing backward. The tracks are equipped with strange, extended connectors that don't match standard factory blueprints. Most disturbing of all are the impacts. The front armor is scarred with 3 deep gouges where high-velocity German armor-piercing rounds struck the metal, and defying all physics known to the Ronson lighter myth, bounced off. Inside the hull, sealed by the clay environment, lies a leather satchel containing a map case. The maps are not standard issue. They are hand-drawn overlays showing firing solutions. That should not have been possible with 1944 technology. This tank was part of a ghost unit, a battalion that official histories acknowledge but whose specific, groundbreaking tactics have been buried under 80 years of misconceptions. For decades, the narrative has been that American tanks were death traps, inferior tin cans that only won through sheer numbers. But this steel sarcophagus tells a different story. It suggests that by September 1944, American crews had secretly cracked the code of armored warfare, developing a lethality that terrified even the elite US Panzer divisions. If you want to see how this story unfolds, hit the like button. The discovery raises a terrifying question. If the American Sherman was truly the inferior, tank history claims, why does this specific vehicle show evidence of hunting down and destroying superior German Panthers at point-blank range? What tactic did this crew use to survive 3 direct hits from a high-velocity cannon? The answer lies not in the specifications of the engine or the thickness of the steel, but in the terrifying, synchronized violence contained within the waterlogged pages of that map case. To understand the magnitude of this discovery, we must rewind to a time when American armor was not the predator, but the prey. The man who would eventually revolutionize this warfare, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, was 30 years old in 1943, a cigar-chomping aggressive tactician who masked a brilliant analytical mind behind a rough cavalryman exterior. He was known for his short stature and even shorter temper regarding incompetence. But in early 1943, men like Abrams were shackled by a military doctrine that was fundamentally broken. The United States Army entered the European theater with a fatal misconception known as the tank destroyer doctrine. The top brass believed that tanks should not fight other tanks. The job of the Sherman was to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. Enemy armor. was supposed to be handled by lightly armored, open-topped tank destroyers. It was a theory that looked excellent on paper in Washington, D.C. war rooms. However, reality has a way of crushing theories under the weight of high explosives. In February 1943, at the Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, this doctrine met the hardened veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. The result was a slaughter. In the span of a week, American forces lost 183 tanks. The German Panzers, coordinating with anti-tank guns and Stuka dive bombers, dismantled the inexperienced American formations. The American shells from the 75 guns bounced harmlessly off the frontal armor of the German Tigers, while the German 88 guns tore through the Shermans as if they were made of paper. The psychological blow was catastrophic. American tankers began to lose faith in their equipment. They called their tanks Purple Heart boxes. The timeline of the war was accelerating, and the invasion of Fortress Europe was looming. If the Americans landed in France with these same tactics, the beaches of Normandy would become a graveyard of burning steel. The generals in the Pentagon scrambled to upgun the tanks, rushing the 76 gun into production, but they missed the core problem. It wasn't just about the gun. It was about how the pieces moved on the board. But amidst the wreckage of Kasserine, a quiet revolution was beginning. Commanders on the ground, men like Abrams and the erratic but brilliant Lafayette, began to realize that survival didn't depend on following the manual. It depended on speed, violence of action, and a secret weapon that the Germans had critically underestimated: the radio. While German tanks had radios, the American system of artillery integration was light years ahead. If only the tank crews could learn to use it effectively while under fire. There were whispers of secret training grounds in England where new protocols were being drilled. Protocols that violated the Army's strict separation of branches. Tankers were talking directly to fighter pilots. Artillery observers were riding in the lead tanks. Foreshadowing the carnage to come, a report from a chaotic skirmish in Sicily noted a single Sherman platoon holding off a company of Tigers, not by outshooting them, but by drowning them in proximity-fused artillery fire within seconds of contact. What they didn't know was that the Germans were also evolving. By 1944, the Wehrmacht had deployed the Panther tank in mass numbers. The Panther was faster, better armored, and possessed a gun that could kill a Sherman from 2 kilometers away. As the Allies prepared for D-Day, the technological gap had widened into a chasm. The stage was set for a massacre, unless the Americans could change the very nature of the game before the first ramp dropped on Omaha Beach. The breakout began 50 days after D-Day, in late July 1944. The departure from the Normandy bridgehead was not a parade. It was a desperate clawing. Through hell, the destination for the Third Army, led by the flamboyant General George Patton, was the open plains of France, but the escape route lay through the bocage. This was a nightmare landscape of ancient hedgerows, earthen walls 10 feet high, topped with tangled roots and trees, bordering fields no larger than a football pitch. For every 100 yards gained, the Americans paid in blood. A single German sniper or a hidden Panzerfaust team could halt an entire column. The Sherman tanks, designed for mobility, were trapped in these earthen cages. When a tank tried to climb over a hedge, it exposed its thin underbelly armor to enemy fire. The morale of the crews plummeted as the summer heat turned the interiors of their vehicles into stifling ovens, smelling of sweat, oil, and fear. However, the ingenuity of the American soldier is born of desperation. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen, serving in the 2nd Armored Division, welded steel prongs salvaged from German beach obstacles to the front of a tank. This rhino cutter allowed the Sherman to slice through the hedgerows at 15 miles per hour, bursting into the next field with guns blazing, carrying the earth with it as a natural shield. This was the first turning point. It transformed the terrain from a trap into a highway. With the hedgerows breached, Patton unleashed the Third Army in Operation Cobra. The speed was blinding. Columns of armor moved 60, sometimes 70 miles a day. The logistics were a nightmare. Fuel trucks, the famous Red Ball Express, struggled to keep up with the ravenous thirst of the tanks, which consumed 60 gallons every hour at combat speeds. Commanders had to make hard decisions, bypassing pockets of resistance, leaving enemy garrisons to wither on the vine while the spearheads raced toward the German border. But the real test, the moment that would define the legacy of American armor, arrived in September 1944 near the town of Arracourt. The weather turned foul. A thick, impenetrable fog descended on the Lorraine region, grounding the American air support that had acted as their guardian angel. Visibility dropped to 50 yards. The temperature plummeted, chilling the crews in their steel boxes. Into this blind gray void moved the 111th and 113th Panzer brigades, brand new units equipped with factory-fresh Panther tanks. On paper, it should have been a rout. The Panthers outclassed the Shermans in every metric, but the Germans were blind. As the American 4th Armored Division advanced, led by Creighton Abrams, 37th Tank Battalion, they didn't stop. They didn't dig in. The critical turning point occurred when a platoon of Shermans, commanded by Lieutenant Turner, detected the rumble of Maybach engines in the mist. Instead of retreating, they charged. They used the fog to their advantage, closing the distance until they were practically rubbing paint with the enemy. At 150 yards, the Sherman's 75 gun, usually useless against a Panther's front, could punch through the thinner side armor. The sensory overload was absolute, the deafening crump of high-velocity rounds displacing the air, the scream of metal shearing against metal, the blinding flashes in the fog. Lafayette Poole in his tank, in the mood, was in the thick of it. He didn't wait for targets to present themselves. He sensed them. He ordered his driver to flank, drifting the 30-ton tank like a race car, putting a round into a Panther's turret ring before the German gunner could even traverse. The arrival of the rest of the German force should have overwhelmed them, but the Americans had perfected their secret weapon. Inside the tanks, commanders were screaming coordinates into their microphones. Miles away, 105 and 155 howitzers adjusted their aim. Within 60 seconds, a time unheard of in any other army, a curtain of steel descended. The German tanks, buttoned up and blind, were separated from their infantry support. The American Shermans swarmed them, hitting. From the flanks, retreating and hitting again. By the time the smoke cleared, the impossible had happened. The fields of Arracourt were a graveyard of burning Panthers. The 4th Armored Division had not just survived, they had annihilated the enemy. They claimed a kill ratio of nearly 3-to-1. They had destroyed 86 German tanks and 114 other vehicles while losing only 25 of their own. It was a victory that defied all logic, a triumph of software over hardware. Following the war, a strange phenomenon occurred. The victory at Arracourt and the revolutionary tactics that enabled it were quietly swept under the rug of popular history. The narrative that solidified in the 1950s was one of American material superiority, not tactical brilliance. Books and movies portrayed the Sherman as a tragic failure, a mass-produced mistake that only won because the US had more tanks than the Germans had shells. Interrogations of captured German generals contributed to this distortion. Officers, Like von Manteuffel and Guderian, writing their memoirs, refused to admit they had been outmaneuvered by amateurs. They blamed Hitler's interference, the lack of fuel, or the overwhelming Allied air power. They never credited the American tank crews who had outfought them on the ground. When military historians interviewed them, they nodded along, solidifying the myth of the superior Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, the men who had lived through the battles returned home and integrated into a society that wanted to forget. They became postmen, mechanics, and insurance salesmen. Lafayette Poole, who lost his leg in the final days of the push, lived a quiet life in Texas. He rarely spoke of the specific geometries of death he had mastered. The specific manuals and after-action reports, AARs, from units like the 4th Armored were filed away in dusty archives in Maryland, stamped, classified, or simply lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of the Cold War. Investigators and serious historians who tried to challenge the death trap narrative in the 1970s and 80s were often dismissed. The publication of books like Death Traps by Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer who only saw the destroyed tanks and never the victories, cemented the public perception. Cooper's vivid descriptions of burning crews became the definitive truth, overshadowing the tactical reality. The evidence of the advanced fire control systems and the specialized assault gun tactics was ignored. Time passed. The 1990s came and went. The veterans began to die of old age. The secrets of how they actually fought, the intricate dance of radio frequencies, the modified suspension settings, the unauthorized engine tweaks, seemed destined to vanish. The physical evidence, the tanks themselves, were mostly scrapped or turned into monuments, their interiors welded shut, their stories sealed in darkness. But there remained a few investigators who were suspicious of the official story. They looked at the casualty rates and the kill claims and saw discrepancies. If the Sherman was so bad, why were there so many destroyed Tigers recorded in sector logs where no air support was present? Why did certain battalions have survival rates triple that of others? They began to hunt for the missing link, the field manuals that were never printed in Washington but written in grease pencil on the back of ration boxes. The secret died with him, or so they thought, until the excavator in Lorraine hit that piece of metal in 2023. The excavation team in Arracourt, led by Dr. Elena Corvo, a specialist in battlefield archaeology, sets up a perimeter around the sunken Sherman. They erect a white tent over the site to protect the artifact from the elements. This is not just a recovery. It is a crime scene investigation. They bring in laser scanners and spectral analyzers usually reserved for aerospace crashes. As they peel back the layers of history, the tank begins to speak. The first reveal, the first anomaly is the hull itself. As the team cleans the frontal armor, they discover it isn't standard cast steel. The chemical analysis reveals a high manganese content, but more importantly, there are additional plates welded over the ammunition stowage areas, the so-called applique armor. But beneath the rust, they find concrete. The crew had poured concrete between the steel plates, a desperate field modification to shatter the kinetic energy of German-shaped charges. This wasn't factory standard. This was a crew taking their survival into their own hands, defying regulations that claimed the extra weight would ruin the transmission. The second reveal. Inside the turret, the team finds the ammunition racks. The Ronson myth claims Shermans burned because they used gasoline engines. This is false. Most nations used gas. They burned because the ammo was stored dry. However, inside this tank, the racks are surrounded by jackets filled with a mixture of water and glycerin. This wet stowage system was a late-war innovation, but the logbook indicates this tank was retrofitted with it in the field months before the official rollout. The dates in the logbook prove that American maintenance depots were innovating faster than the factories in Detroit could keep up. The third reveal. But the most shocking discovery lies in the radio equipment. The standard Sherman had an SCR 508 radio. This tank has that, but it also contains a secondary, unauthorized receiver spliced into the commander's intercom. This receiver is tuned to the specific frequency used by the IX Tactical Air Command. This crew wasn't relaying requests through a chain of command. They were talking directly to the P-47 Thunderbolt pilots overhead. This level of integration was strictly forbidden for a standard tank crew, yet the wiring is professional, deliberate. The fourth reveal. Dr. Corvo opens the map case found in Section 1. The paper is brittle, flaking at the edges. Under UV light, the faded pencil marks glow. The map doesn't just show terrain, it shows a series of pre-calculated kill zones. The crew had worked with artillery surveyors to map every intersection and ridge line in the Arracourt sector before the battle. They weren't hunting blindly. They were luring the Germans into pre-registered traps. However, container number 4, a small, watertight ammunition box welded under the gunner's seat, held something that changed everything. Inside is a notebook belonging to the tank commander, a Sergeant Miller. The entries are frantic but legible. September 18th. Colonel Abrams gave the order, "We are not to stop. Shoot the short halt. If we stop, we die. The Krauts can't traverse fast enough." The notebook reveals the ultimate secret. The American tactic wasn't a single maneuver. It was a psychological shift. The entry details a technique called the violent pivot. The Shermans would charge a Panther, forcing the German driver to stop to fire accurately. As the Germans stopped, the Sherman would pivot violently, throwing off the German aim, while the Sherman's gyro-stabilizer, a piece of tech the Germans lacked, kept their guns steady enough to fire on the move. The forensic analysis of the gouges on the front armor confirms this. The angle of impact shows the tank was moving at a 45-degree angle to the incoming fire when it was hit. They were drifting. They were fighting like corsairs, not heavy cavalry. This confirms that the victory at Arracourt wasn't luck. It was the result of a deliberate, high-risk tactical doctrine developed by the crews themselves, far away from the eyes of the generals. The discovery of Sergeant Miller's tank and his logbook forces a complete rewriting of the history of armored warfare in World War II. It vindicates the decades of work by revisionist historians who argued that the American tanker was the most lethal soldier on the battlefield. The death trap was a myth born of survivor bias and German propaganda. This reshapes what we thought. We knew about the Allied victory. It wasn't just industrial might that crushed the Nazis, it was superior tactical flexibility. The German army was rigid, top-down, and obsessed with technical specifications. The American army, as evidenced by the modifications on Miller's tank, was an army of tinkerers and improvisers. They treated war as an engineering problem to be solved. The implications extend to the legendary Battle of the Bulge. When Patton pivoted the Third Army 90 degrees to relieve Bastogne, moving 133,000 vehicles in 48 hours, it wasn't just a logistical miracle. It was a feat made possible because crews like Miller's had already mastered the art of high-speed, independent operation. They didn't need to be micromanaged. They knew how to fight, how to fix their own machines, and how to kill tanks that were twice their size. This discovery also explains why the kill ratios shifted so dramatically in late 1944. At Arracourt, the Americans achieved a 3-1 kill ratio. In the Ardennes, despite the surprise attack, American armored divisions decimated the German Panzer Lehr. The violent pivot, the direct air integration, and the time-on-target artillery, where 12 battalions would fire so that all shells landed simultaneously, created a storm of violence that no amount of German steel thickness could withstand. We now understand that the men who fought in these tanks were not victims. They were experts. The Ronson nickname was largely a post-war invention or a dark joke among troops, not a statistical reality. The truth is that by 1945, the safest place to be on the battlefield was inside a late-model Sherman, surrounded by a crew that knew exactly what they were doing. Among the items found in the hull of the buried tank, nestled between the radio and the hull wall, was a small tin box. Inside, protected from the mud, was a silver dollar from 1922 and a black-and-white photograph. It shows a young woman standing on a porch in Abilene, Texas. Squinting into the sun, on the back in faded ink it reads, "Wait for me, Martha." Records show that Sergeant Miller survived the war. He returned to Texas, married Martha, and opened a hardware store. He walked with a limp, a souvenir from shrapnel taken during the crossing of the Rhine. Like so many of his generation, he never bragged about his service. He died in 1988, taking the secrets of the violent pivot and the unauthorized radios to his grave. When the team tracks down his granddaughter, Sarah, she is overwhelmed. She holds the silver dollar, her hands trembling. "He never told us he was a hero," she says, tears welling in her eyes. "He just said he drove a truck with a big gun. He said the real heroes were the ones who didn't come back." The tank itself, now fully excavated, stands as a silent testament to the crew. It is battered, scarred, and modified in ways that would have given a parade ground general a heart attack. But it is beautiful in its brutality. It is the physical embodiment of the American spirit, adaptable, resilient, and deceptively dangerous. Sometimes the truth of history is not found in the grand libraries or the memoirs of famous generals. It is found in the dirt, buried under feet of clay, waiting for the light of day to reveal the ingenuity of the common soldier. In the end, the victory in Europe was not won by the tank with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. It was won by the tank with the smartest crew. It was won by men who welded concrete to their hulls, who wired radios to talk to the sky, and who learned to dance with 30 tons of steel in the killing fields of France. The field in Arracourt is quiet now. The drainage ditch has been filled, and the housing development will soon cover the spot where Sergeant Miller and his crew once held the line against the might of the German Empire. But the tank has been moved to a museum, a rusted monument to the day the underdog bit back. Comment which mystery we should investigate next.